Addiction. Addiction. When we think of drug addiction, we often think of someone making an active choice to heavily use and abuse a certain substance. We don't think of a young businesswoman who took prescription pain medication after a surgery. In 2016, over 20,000 people died in the United States alone due to an overdose on prescription opioids. In some people, opioid addiction is highly likely, even when taken in proper doses by doctors' directions. But what makes that businesswoman and those 20,000 people to become addicted to opioids, while others stayed impartial? Opioids are a class of drugs that act in the nervous system to produce feelings of pleasure and pain relief. All opioids are prescription opioids with the exception of heroin, but today our focus will be on the prescription type. Prescription opioids are legally prescribed by healthcare providers to help manage severe pain, such as chronic non-cancer pain, musculoskeletal pain, and post-surgical care. The most commonly prescribed opioids are oxycodone, fentanyl, buprenorphine, methadone, oxymorphine, hydrocodone, codeine, and morphine. Opioids work through the central nervous system, specifically the endogenous opioid system. The endogenous opioid system consists of endogenous opioids and their receptors. Let's break that down. There are two types of opioids, endogenous opioids and exogenous opioids. Endogenous opioids are opioid substances that are naturally produced in the body. They regulate pain and reward, and they are essential for the body's health. Exogenous opioids are prescription opioids and heroin. They exert their effects by tricking our body and binding to the endogenous opioid receptors. To clarify, receptors are chemical structures made of protein that respond to stimulus and transmit signals to sensory nerves. When the exogenous opioids bind to the receptors, a series of chemical changes occur between and within the neurons, releasing dopamine and blocking pain signals to the spinal cord and brain. Over the past decade, there has been a steady rise in opioid addiction, with over 15 million people possessing this addiction in 2016. And the number is still rising. Prescribed opioid addiction is a long-lasting chronic addiction that can cause major health, social, and economic problems. It is characterized by a powerful, compulsive urge to use opioid drugs, despite harmful consequences. It often leads to overdose, which causes breathing to stop and the person to go unconscious and die if not given immediate help. Everyone develops a dependence on opioids after extended use and experience negative symptoms after immediately stopping, but only some get an addiction. Patients who grow dependent on opioids and stop their usage merely experience muscle cramps and anxiety, while those who are addicted experience strong cravings for the drug. It is unknown exactly why some people are more likely to become addicted than others, but through patterns and shared DNA qualities between opioid addicts, we can come up with genetic markers and factors that contribute to making one more predisposed to becoming addicted. Opioid addiction comes from a combination of environmental, lifestyle, and genetic factors. For example, behavioral disinhibition is shown to contribute to addiction risk. Behavioral disinhibition is a lack of restraint in social situations, impulsivity, and poor risk assessment. Poor coping skills also seem to play a role in prescription opioid addiction. Other external factors include a history of substance abuse, childhood abuse, psychiatric disorders, or family members with an addiction. While it is common to believe that surrounding genetics there should be one main opioid gene, there are actually several genes that are shown to contribute to risk. Genes surrounding cravings, impulsivity, etc. Review of many scientific studies suggests significant heritability in opioid addiction, but the evidence from molecular genetic studies is inconclusive. The Harvard twin study of substance abuse found that genetics contributed to 84% of opioid addiction risk. Despite the lack of conclusive information, certain variations in receptors and DNA have been associated with addiction risk. For starters, there are dopamine receptors. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter found all across the nervous system. Higher levels of gene DRD2, also known as dopamine receptor D2, is highly associated with opioid addiction. DRD2 regulates, controls, and releases levels of dopamine. In people who are predisposed to opioid addiction, their dopamine levels are often more limited and regulated than others. This causes the high of the prescription opioids to be more drastic, resulting in a higher likelihood of addiction. The DRD3 gene, also known as dopamine receptor D3, is also associated with opioid addiction. This gene is associated with higher sensation and risk-seeking, a risk factor associated with opioid addiction. The DRD4 gene, also known as dopamine receptor D4, is highly prevalent in opioid addicts, but scientists aren't exactly sure why. The opioid receptors OPRM1, OPRD1, and OPRK1, and some neutronic factors are also highly associated with opioid addiction. There are many other genes, but the results are not conclusive enough to confidently mention. As you can see, the research surrounding prescribed opioid addiction is very inconclusive. Prescription opioid drugs are very complex, and the layers behind why some people are more likely to get addicted are still being unraveled. However, the one conclusion that we can draw is that opioid addiction is likely to be hereditary, and the risk is highly increased through genetics. There are many different genes and factors that contribute to whether one is predisposed to becoming addicted or not. But as science continually improves, we come closer to conclusive results and answers. Thank you for coming to my Talent Talk.